I think that if you looked at the average male, female in the United States and looked at the deficits and benefits of of the sex, what are the advantages to being a man? What are the disadvantages? It turns out that it's just a complicated mix of blessings and burdens. There are ways in which men are privileged and ways in which women are. And it's impossible to say who's better off at this point. And it also depends on the complex set of advantages and burdens, and it varies by social class and so forth. But it's absurd to simply say the women are so much worse off and the men are. I mean, I think it's a central fallacy in feminism. They fail to notice, well, let me put it this way. I think too much of the feminist movement focuses on men and women at the very top in professions, like how many CEOs of Fortune 500s. And it's true, there are far more men than women, and it would be, I would like to see more men who are, senators and just at the top of their profession. But what happens when you look further down in society and people who are not, in the top 10% in terms of education and elite degrees and so forth? It's a different picture. If you look at working class men and women, it's, both have burdens and challenges. And one of the special burdens that a working class young man has is he's likely to be less educated. And he's entering an information economy where, as I keep saying, education has never been more important, and literacy has never been more important. And we have a large cohort of young men coming along who are not going to find a place for themselves in this economy. And so the fact that we have a women's movement that has only looked and primarily focused on some imbalances at the very pinnacle of society and not looked at just the reality of the lives. And to be more specific, if you look at, they'll talk about the wage gap, and that's true. There's a gap and we want to close it, but I think we have to be honest about it. It's not as extreme as they say, and most of it's explained by the different jobs men and women do, or how many hours you work per week, things like that. But also men do most of the dangerous jobs. There's a huge gap in mortality in the workplace. Like, I don't know, something like 5,000 Americans die in the workplace every year. 94% of them are men. So that, that's, then it goes for, that's mortality. Also it's true for injuries. And I mean, men do most of the dangerous, gritty jobs, the jobs where you're outside or pitching tar or on top of roofs or construction. These are largely male undertakings, and that has to be factored in when you're doing this calculus of well-being. And but we don't do that. We just don't do it. And I'm still a feminist. I believe in equality, but that means you care about men and women. And you don't see, as you mentioned before, you don't see it as a competition where you have to be on one team. Because I think that also if men are in trouble or boys are in trouble, so are women. We're in this together. So what we're doing now is so perverse, because by not attending to the education of young men, there's going to be a mismatch. People typically marry someone with a similar education. What's going to happen? I mean, we know what's happening right now. A lot of people aren't finding each other. There's a lot of loneliness. I just don't think the solution is to focus on one sex and not the other.
I want to come back to the relationship issues, the gaps that are widening. But one of the things that it seems like is happening for girls that is maybe more exaggerated in our times right now is what Jonathan Haidt's been noting about the impacts of social media in particular, and that the anxiety, the self-harm, the general psychological profile for girls seems to be collapsing farther faster than boys in response to their screen time. How have you looked at this? How do you understand what's happening to boys and girls here?
At first, I thought that Jonathan Haidt, whom I greatly respect, but at first I thought he was exaggerating and it wasn't that bad. But I'm convinced that something is amiss, and it does seem to correlate with the rise of this times girls spend on social media. And I'd be very worried as a parent. I mean, I think people are worried. I will say this. It's another reason that we should attend to gender differences, because there's these disparate impacts. So I think it's clear to me that as we pull back on recess, that had a very bad impact on boys. And schools have, by the way, cut back from, a lot of parents think it was the way it was when they were kids, but it's not at all. Some schools don't have it at all. But with girls, I would think social media, there may be a disparate impact. And Jonathan Haidt has shown evidence that there is, and it's a reason to be aware, to attend to the differences and how it may affect kids. But I will say one thing. There's one of the reasons teachers might give that they want boys to write about their feelings, and they want schools to be more feeling-centered, is that they think this is necessary to combat the dangers of, some unhinged masculinity or something. But there was a very interesting study by, I think it was Amanda Rose at the time. She was at University of Pennsylvania, and she interviewed a huge group of adolescent boys and girls and asked them how they felt after if they had a terrible problem, how did they feel after they talked about it? Did talking it through, make them feel better? And she asked this, 14, 15-year-old kids. And the girls said, absolutely, they felt better. They were so glad they could talk about it with their mom or their best friend. And the boys, with huge disparity. The boys said, first of all, they thought it was weird. And that was the main word that kept coming up, and a waste of time. And it didn't make them feel better. And we have a lot of evidence that this is a difference. So most people rush in and say, well, that's not good for the boys. But actually what they found was that the boys were a little more stoical and could sort of compartmentalize and move on. And the girls were ruminators. When they had a problem, they wanted to talk about it, and they thought about it, and they ruminated. And these psychologists concluded that maybe girls would be better off if we encouraged a little more stoicism. Rather than spending all our efforts to get the boys to be ruminators and constantly talking about how I felt and what it meant, and which most of them don't want to do. And any mother of a boy will, or father might know about this. But what if it turns out that that's adaptive, and that what the boys are doing is maybe helpful to them? And maybe we've, in this highly therapeutic society where we're so focused on people's emotional states and things, maybe girls have a tendency for that. Maybe we've exaggerated it, and now they have to cope with all of the highs and lows that can be brought on by social media, and what people are saying about you, what's going on, all that. It may be just impossible. So it just may be unfortunate that all of these things have come into play at once, and the sensitivity of girls, which we have encouraged, is helping, adding to the misery.
It strikes me that there's something kind of perverse at play with this focus on therapy and on talking about and ruminating on problems, partly because it seems to me like when you conjure up the feeling of something that was painful, you essentially re-injure yourself to some extent. To some extent, you relive the experience. And it seems like there's a feedback loop there that is not fundamentally healing, but is actually sort of a multi-layered traumatizing that goes on.
Everything is classified as traumatic. That used to be just, well, first of all, if you think back to how children grew up in the previous generations. I mean, life was a lot harder, and I don't wish a hard life on my child, and I'm guilty of being a helicopter parent as much as anyone else. It's just, it's impossible not to. But on the other hand, I recognize that my parents were more aloof. They were too busy with life to, and challenges, and three kids, and they were very young. And they, basically they just didn't pay that much attention to us until, you had to be home at 9 in the summer before dark. I mean, and I don't ever remember them calling up a teacher or anything. I didn't want them to have anything to do with my school. And now parents are so involved, and the child, I'm worried that they're really not learning basic skills of just how to deal with the challenge of life. If you talk to psychologists now, and they've had to increase their numbers at colleges, practically all the kids have a diagnosis, and they're coming for they can't solve the problem. They don't like their roommate or something. They don't seem to have the skills to deal with adversity. And so that's something else and I think Abigail's book was a great reminder to parents that there might be a better way than treating everything as an occasion for examining your inner feelings. Sometimes it's better just to move on. And that goes against the ethos, but it may explain why boys are having a less difficult time with social media. They have another problem with social media. They have a problem with getting addicted with the video games, but even that's exaggerated. A lot of those boys and I spent a lot of time with that literature looking at boys and their video games, and for years they tried to show, well, it's making them more violent. That's not been proved. The most violent games of all were, coming out of Japan, and they didn't have high crime rates and things. I mean, they haven't been able to find a correlation. But they said, well, it's wasting their time. But a lot of those boys are learning a lot of skills. They became very interested in the techniques and the tactics, and they became early adapters of all sorts of technology, and they're off, majoring in engineering, that sort of thing. So I'm not sure that that's as harmful as people think. But I do wonder if we haven't made girls more vulnerable by pushing this culture of always being this kind of confessional and feeling centered, and identifying everything as traumatic, and getting all excited about any adversity in her life, rather than teaching young women to be a little tougher.
If you like this clip, you should check out the full video and all the other great content we've got at Dad Saves America. So be sure to hit the like button, subscribe, and ring that bell so you won't miss our new stuff as it drops each week.